The United States attack on Iran is not primarily because of China, but China is impressed with some aspects of the demonstration of military power from Venezuela all the way to Iran. At the same time, they know that it's possible the U.S. could get embroiled in a protracted conflict, a quagmire, a disaster even, if this war drags on and escalates further. And in the past, they've often seen such kind of intervention by the United States as something that can distract the U.S. from a focus on Asia. Now, 20 years ago or 25 years ago, China proclaimed at the highest level that the world, that it was seeing a century of, rather, a period of strategic opportunity, largely because of U.S. distraction in the Middle East and WTO accession. The question now is, will it see strategic opportunity again if the U.S. is bogged down in the Middle East?
And I want to turn to oil prices. We were just talking about that. And if they stay elevated, Rush, how will that impact China's long-term calculations when it comes to its oil and energy security?
Well, as we just heard, 45 to 50% of all of China's energy, or its crude imports, transits the Strait of Hormuz. And right now, a lot of that tanker traffic is effectively stopped. Even if vessels identify themselves as Chinese, accurately or inaccurately, it doesn't necessarily make a huge difference. If oil does, in fact, reach $100 to $150, that will have impacts that are inflationary for China and for the world. I think it is important to keep in mind, though, that China does have massive stockpiles. 1.2 to 1.4 billion barrels are right now stockpiled, and that's probably enough for 3 to 4 months of reserves. But that doesn't mean that the economic impact is going to be zero. It's going to be there. It just might take a little bit of time before it shows up. It's certainly the market impact is already occurring now. I think it's also possible that some of the teapot refineries in China that take Iranian oil and refine it, some of those refineries are going to be shut down in the period ahead. Meanwhile, put aside energy, China has a number of other equities at stake in the Middle East. It's got people there that it needs to evacuate. It's evacuated several thousand, but there are more to go. It has to find a way to balance also its criticism of the U.S. with the desire for a successful summit in the period ahead. And it's got to stand with Gulf countries at the same time. It's a lot of different competing objectives they have to kind of hold together in the same period.
And how much does China's green transition help cushion these oil shocks, do you think?
Well, there's no question that China is better off than it used to be. Something like 20 years ago, it was President Hu Jintao who wrote about how China faced all kinds of challenges related to what he called the Malacca dilemma, the idea that China's crude oil flows through the Strait of Malacca, many of which first came from the Strait of Hormuz, could get intercepted. And that was a big concern for the last 20 years, not just with the green energy revolution, but with an investment in overland oil pipelines. They've been able to reduce some of their vulnerability. The most important factor really isn't the green transition. It's quite frankly the significant reserves that they've built up. So will it help relative to the past? Yes. But as we're already seeing, there are market impacts that are showing up right now across the world, and the inflationary impact is likely going to be there as well. We also know that Chinese leadership does not want to see this crisis escalate. Just yesterday, Foreign Affairs Commission Director Wang Yi said that this is a conflict that shouldn't have happened. And, he basically said China did not want to see further escalation. All that suggests some degree of anxiety about the economic impact.
Yeah, and just talking about Wang Yi's comments, it's very interesting tracking Beijing's rhetoric in recent days, obviously saying that Iran should defend its sovereignty and security, but also saying that China is impartial when it comes to working with Middle Eastern countries, urging Iran to consider the, quote, legitimate concerns of its neighbor, and also, as you say, balancing its relationship with the U.S. here. So did you think that this time, talking about Iran, China actually hasn't been very forthcoming in supporting Iran because of its relationship with other Gulf states and the U.S.?
I think that's an excellent point. China has always had to balance its relationship with Iran with the Gulf states, and right now that's particularly acute. China's come out and actually praised many of the Gulf countries for their statements about the conflict, and it's also suggested, as you noted, that Iran should not be striking at those Gulf countries. So that's a pretty strong position, but at the same time, they are rhetorically supporting Iran by saying, again, this is a war that should not have happened. China is opposing regime change formally. They're suggesting all of this is a violation of international law, and they are standing in defense of Iranian sovereignty. Of course, those are words. And when it comes to actions, we haven't seen China take actions that really advance Iran's interests in a meaningful way. For the most part, China is simply not involved. It's largely neutral when it comes to actions in the conflict between the U.S., Israel, and Iran. So that's a pretty interesting position. And I do think some of this limited rhetoric about the U.S. is related to the fact they want a successful meeting with President Trump, a successful summit in Beijing.
Rush Martin here. Let me jump in. I'm glad you brought up the summit because, we talked to some experts who were saying earlier on, just a couple of days ago, that, maybe there's a big question mark hanging over the summit, whether or not it's going to happen at all, whether it's going to be delayed or not, because China typically doesn't like this kind of uncertainty in the run-up to big meets like that. At the same time, though, you made a good point, and that is, after Venezuela and now Iran, China could be actually looking at the U.S. and going, okay, interesting display of power. And as you and I both know, back in the day, Mao Zedong, his famous saying was, look, power comes from the barrel of a gun. So blunt question to you, is the summit still on or not?
I think the summit is very much still on. I know there's probably been frustration on both sides with some of the planning, but we've seen, signals from China indicating that the summit is on. Wang Yi yesterday basically did not indicate in any way that the summit was off. He said more planning needed to be done. And of course, media is suggesting the summit is on as well. And, quite frankly, I think that for China, the summit is important. I mean, it is a symbolic victory to have the President of the United States go to Beijing to negotiate. And they're hoping they have pretty clear objectives. They're hoping they can maybe reduce the tariffs that are on China. The Supreme Court has made its decision. There's another tariff structure now in place on China. But China still wants to see as many of those tariffs come off as possible. There's also hope for stability. China feels like it's been able to do very well in the trade war last year. They'd like to consolidate those gains, if you will, and maintain stability. And on the U.S. side, you're hearing some talk of big commodity purchases, Boeing aircraft purchases, but also a desire not to have major summit deliverables, but rather even Jamieson Greer, the USTR, indicating the goal here is stability. So if both sides want stability, then both sides have an incentive not to let Iran get in the way. But there's one thing I do need to flag, which is that China's perceptions of the U.S. are very important to determining what it does. Historically, it's seen the U.S. as in decline, really from the financial crisis, especially after COVID, with President Trump's reelection. But there are these moments when the U.S. uses force that cause them to reassess. Now, again, if Iran becomes a quagmire, their perception of decline will be back. But I think right now we're seeing America has shown it is the only country that can project power globally, and that is something China cannot match.
Yeah, but the word quagmire has a lot of, historical relevance here, usually related to Vietnam. But on oil itself, Russia, I'm curious. We've made the point, and you've made the point that, China is actually in a pretty good position because, as Elaine noted, they spent the whole last year, if not more, doing what they usually do when prices are cheap, and that is stocking up on oil, and the reserves are just fine for at least 3-4 months. Having said that, though, I mean, if, and this is a big if, this stretches on, there's the likelihood that China, or what do you think the likelihood is of China having to turn to their, I'm not sure what to call this relationship, they call it a partnership with no limits, right, to Russia for their oil?
Well, right now, China imports a significant amount of oil from Russia anyway through overland pipelines. Perhaps there's the question of whether more oil could be imported via maritime routes. But for the most part, China has taken the last 20 years to reduce some of its dependence on maritime oil flows. Now, 40 to 50% of its oil imports via sea still come through the Strait of Hormuz, but that means maybe the other 50% don't. Of course, there's going to be upward pressure on prices, but still, China, plus with the stockpile, the overland oil, and perhaps other maritime oil shipments, might be able to do okay. In addition, they've actually already said that some of the refined petroleum that's within the country, they don't want it to be sold. They've told refiners, don't push the oil out of China. It's time to keep it here. So they're taking the steps right now to increase their resilience if this drags on. But the truth is, no one knows how long it's going to go. Certainly not Washington. And if Washington doesn't know, certainly not Beijing. So the risks are there for China's economy, as they are for all Asian economies. China may be unique, along with Japan, for having pretty strong stockpiles, but in the end, the stockpiles are only part of a solution, not a full solution.
Yeah, Rush, you probably agree that if anybody, it's Iran that would like this war to drag on more. They're pursuing sort of a war of attrition here. And we've talked about this whole thing about missile math, right? Who's got how many missiles left after the 12-day war and who's built up their inventories faster. But here I want to get into the China connection here potentially, and you know this as well as I do. There are substantiated reports that China has been supplying, or at least was supplying, precursor chemicals that go into the fuel for the missiles that Iran has been using. Ahead of the summit at the end of this month, do you expect, or are we seeing signs that China is willing to back off on that front as well as on other assistance? Because, I mean, yes, China is balancing in the Middle East, but they've been involved in many other different ways in Iran for many years, and it's not just on the military side.
Well, it's a great point. And when I had the privilege of serving in the last administration, this is an issue I worked on as well. What we saw repeatedly was that China would continue to supply a variety of goods to Russia, of course, in its invasion of Ukraine, and some of those same goods to countries like Iran. And that's not just the energetics, not just the propellants for these rockets, but also, critical semiconductors, parts that are relevant for UAVs and other uncrewed systems. In the Russian case, it was also, machine tools and a lot of other advanced technology that Russia needed to sustain its war machine. And they didn't pull any of that back in the Russia case. It doesn't seem like they'd pull it back necessarily in the Iran case either. Of course, Russia matters more to China than Iran does, but we do kind of have a data point that we can look at here and use to evaluate their likely support of Iran. Now, for Iran, it's likely that their cheap one-way attack UAVs, they have lots of them. They're going to keep sending around the Gulf and at the United States. The U.S. has a variety of ways of taking those down, but some of those are particularly expensive, including the use of interceptors. So you mentioned earlier, political power might flow from the barrel of a gun, to quote Mao. In the 21st century, it seems to flow from your stockpile of precision-guided munitions. Right now, the U.S. does have some challenges with its stockpile, and China, as we know for many years, has been booming when it comes to its own stockpile, and it's been supporting other countries like Iran in their stockpiles too. So if this is a war of attrition, ironically, it will be China's support for Iran that helps drag out the conflict, just like it's China's support for Russia that has helped drag out that conflict.